One, two, three.
So it's important to understand this larger conversation around Ithaca, because in the same way in which I discussed these issues in New Haven and in Berkeley, uh, people are fighting a similar fight, but they many times feel alone. They feel isolated. And many times it's the institutions that they're in engagement with are designed to make them feel alone, to make them feel isolated, to make their claims and their struggles to seem anachronistic, to seem out of place, to seem idealistic and not practical. But I'm here to tell you that the struggles that you're engaging with are part of a larger condition that we will discuss in the context of how Cornell is plundering Ithaca. So what's going on at the backdrop of this story that is putting your small bucolic 10 square miles into the national headlines? Well, first of all, there are strike waves going across the country. A combination of adjunct labor, campus labor, low-wage cafeteria and groundskeeper workers, graduate workers, and even undergraduates from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to all across the state of California are engaging in strike campaigns. A strike wave is capturing the imagination across on campuses across the nation. There is a larger call at the same time for reparations from the condition or ways in which universities and colleges and other nonprofits have had a hand historically in benefiting from both enslaved labor and indigenous land grabs, like Cornell's land grant that comes from indigenous land. There has been a major campaign for police abolition, or at least divestment investment, washing across the country. A major national organization called Cops Off Campus spearheading that. And then finally, across the country, like in Ithaca, we see growing calls by community residents to reconsider the nonprofit tax exemption, specifically with wealthy, in the case of Ithaca, multi-billion-dollar endowed institutions that pay little to no taxes. For far too long, we have seen these as discrete and parallel concerns, when in fact they are actually convergent. They have emerged because of the relatively new higher education landscape that has emerged over the last 30 to 40 years, not by accident, but by design. And Ithaca sits right at the center of this vital struggle. As Brother Rickford alluded to, something's happening right before our eyes. Colleges and universities have become the biggest employers, real estate owners, also healthcare providers, and yes, policing agents in major cities and small college towns all across the country. The idea here is that colleges and universities bring ideas and people together and generate new innovations. With such importance, we have seen higher education's growing control over the economic development and political governance in and across America, or what I call the rise of cities. Universities throughout the nation have become big business. In our cities, they're company towns. And many people celebrate this because of the impacts of innovation, job creation, educational opportunities that this power holds. But there is a cost for those living in the shadows of these ivory towers. For example, campus physical footprint expansions also raise housing costs and can displace residents in neighborhoods of color or working class communities that either surround or once surrounded these growing campuses. Higher education's broad control over labor in entire communities or cities can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts for labor across the board. nonprofit university medical centers, emphasize profitable boutique services, high-profile research, or prioritize student services to the detriment of the indigent care that they required to offer for their tax exemption to local residents. And finally, campus police forces surveil and profile the very same residents. And especially if it's a private university police force, they are held rarely to public account. So even if all schools don't hold all of this power, we are witnessing greater swaths of our cities across the country being turned into a campus. So I'm going to put my history hat for a minute and ask the question, how did we get here? But also, understanding how we got here, how do we reclaim our cities and towns in this era of the university? It's a little bit of history here. By the 1990s, we began to witness a renewed interest in urban life. After decades of urban divestment, the grandchildren of suburban sprawl, young professionals, and empty nesters began powering a back to the city movement in the 1990s. I moved to New York City in 1995 under Rudolph Giuliani, so I know this story very intimately. As urbanites or as suburbanites or small town folk started moving back to the city, we saw quality of life mandates that were, arresting people for taking up too much time in an ATM vestibule, arresting people for taking up more than one seat on the train or on benches, kicking people out of mental health units and turning into luxury housing. This is a part of this whole era because cities began competing with each other for young professionals and empty nesters for their tax base. At the same time, secondary cities like Ithaca or Berkeley or Athens or Madison began upbuilding urban communities, charging or marketing that, well, if you can't live in New York, if you can't live in Chicago, you can't live in LA, come to Santa Cruz, come to Peoria, come to Ithaca, come to Gainesville, where we have urban-like amenities, a university lifestyle, but through at the time, a lower cost of living. Not the case anymore, but this was the sell in the 1990s and 2000s. And it was precisely the community amenities, the commercial amenities associated with university life, concerts, coffee shops, foot traffic congestion, fully wired networking that were marketed as a desirable urban or small town urban lifestyle. Again, Madison, Berkeley, Charlottesville, Ithaca. In this moment, from an economic standpoint, you had city boosters and town boosters. And I have some documents that even Ithaca was in this story, talking about and touting that the that cities had moved from smokestacks of industry to the bell towers of higher education as the driving economic and cultural force in our communities. So that's what's happening on one side. On the other side, universities in the same moment are trying to compensate for shrinking state budget contributions. And whether you're a public university or a private university, directly through grants and funds or indirectly through student loans, you receive public money. So universities are facing shrinking state contributions to higher education, and they are seeking alternative revenue streams. They are being tasked with figuring out new ways to become more, this was a word that was all throughout the literature, entrepreneurial. And you still hear it today. The word today is innovation. So in this moment of the 90s and 2000s, between the interests or the ambitions of city leaders trying to draw in a new tax base and university administrators trying to generate new revenue streams, you have an interest convergence around the convergence or the transition of campuses into lucrative sites of financial capture for new residents, new research, new lifestyles. And in the last 2 decades, we have seen colleges, universities, and other nonprofits undergoing an explosive rise in non-educational units on university campuses, whether it's the real estate department, the university foundation office, campus security, the development office, or the office or department of technology transfer. We are witnessing beefed up executive units that have far outgrown the employees who directly engage in educational tasks, faculty. These non-educational divisions are responsible for using urban planning to bolster higher education's growing influence over land, labor, and commercial development through a retrofitting of campus buildings and campus blocks. At the center of this story of focusing on on campus development and these non-educational divisions over the educational impulse, the backdrop to this is from a larger national economic standpoint. In this moment, the university has become or had become the new face of capitalism. What do I mean by that? That we've shifted from factories in the global north to service and information industries, or what we could call the knowledge economy. Here, academic research is being used to create profitable commercial goods or patents in a range of fields, from pharmaceutical industries and software products to health and life sciences and military defense weaponry. But key to recruiting the best students, faculty, researchers, and their families to do this knowledge work in, say, Ithaca as compared to Philadelphia, is creating an urbane cluster of housing, retail, and nightlife, or what are variously called innovation districts or knowledge communities. And I'm sure you have some version of a research park or innovation district directly in Ithaca that speaks to this point. Because the cover of education as an institution makes these tax-free zones, these knowledge districts, these industrial parks, these innovation districts, it makes these tax-free zones where academic research and labor meet corporate sponsorships, real estate, and retail profits and development. Urban neighborhoods and small town communities are being transformed to optimize what we call value capture, the conversion of neighborhood blocks into tech and university lifestyle profits. Now, while it's not directly in Ithaca, there is no better example of this than Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island in New York City, whose and revenues get funneled back to Ithaca in the very same moment that Ithaca, at that Cornell in Ithaca, says it's strapped for cash. It has time, talent, and resources to build out a Cornell Tech in New York City, alongside of what I'm sure are research parks and tech build-outs in the city of Ithaca as well. So ultimately, what we have here is that the campus has become a planning mechanism to build out universities by retrofitting neighborhood blocks to maximize wealth extraction based on land control, low-wage labor management, whether it be cafeteria workers or graduate students, and the privatization of governance through their own police forces and their influences on local government through alums or through the direct influence of the university. So therefore, we must ask, what makes higher education good for our public? I want to discuss real briefly the issues of land, labor, policing, and endowment, but focusing primarily on land. Off the top, we presume that schools are an inherent public good, most clearly marked by their 501c3 property tax exempt status. But it's this nonprofit designation is what precisely what allows for an easier transfer of public dollars into higher education's private developments with little public scrutiny. The status of an educational institution in the tax code provides a financial shelter to move public dollars into the university's private or quasi-private interests. As you know, these schools pay virtually no taxes on their increasingly prominent footprint, yet they reap the benefits of town services, while residential property taxes and rental property costs rise and public facilities crumble. In 2016, the historically black neighborhood of Witherspoon-Jackson won an $18 million lawsuit against Princeton University, New Jersey, because they started looking around, they realized, wait a minute, our taxes are going up every year, and yet our public infrastructure hasn't changed at all. They looked around, did some research, and realized that they sit next to Princeton University buildings that house multi-million-dollar research for the big pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly. So Eli Lilly sits on tax-exempt land, which is a benefit to them in overhead costs. The university receives millions of dollars in revenue from royalties that comes from the research done to support Eli Lilly. And yet the host community of Witherspoon-Jackson and Princeton, New Jersey more broadly seeks and receives no benefit from this financial arrangement that happens on their land. When the residents did this research, they sued Princeton and again won an $18 million lawsuit. And one resident was so disgusted by what he discovered, he dismissed Princeton as a hedge fund that conducts classes. At the same time, just last year, I was reached out by both Washington University, St. Louis, and the University of California, or Berkeley, the city of Berkeley in California, because what they're witnessing for different reasons are the creation of these things called mini dorms. So in the case of UC Berkeley, it's because the university is increasing its enrollment, but refuses to build campus housing. So students are spilling out into the city of Berkeley. In the case of Washington University, St. Louis, the university itself is moving into a working class interracial community called University City, and is taking and buying up single family homes like the one on your screen and converting it into mini dorms. So what happens with this? A single family home becomes a multi-unit dwelling for students, which raises the cost and the value of that house, which then makes single family homes in these communities in Berkeley or in University City, Missouri, unaffordable for working class single families that once resided in these neighborhoods. So I just want to give you a flavor of the range of ways in which universities take their tax-exempt status, exert it on host communities to detrimental effects for those who live in the surrounding environments. Now, I know we can get caught up in this conversation about it's just about homeowners, homeowner populism. It's about I pay my mortgage, I pay my property taxes. But this is a bigger story than just simply homeowners. This is about mortgages. It's also about rental costs. It's about public infrastructure. It's about transportation. It's about public facilities for community development, for community centers, for seniors who are on fixed incomes and cannot cope with the cost of living. So this is a story that's bigger than just simply homeowners and kind of a homeowner populist framework. Bigger than just simply land, but the land that universities use to expand and build out its wealth is also the place and exploit low-wage labor. Yes, we think about, faculty, where right now 70% of faculty on university campuses across the country are basically glorified gig workers, temps. But the biggest workers on university campuses are not faculty. It is the non-tenured researchers, and it is the low-wage cafeteria, grounds crew, and support staff workers who are on 9-month schedules and are usually on furlough in the 3 months of the summer, to the point where across the country, you can have campus workers have a full-time job and still be eligible for public assistance. So that work, and then the work of researchers that is not considered to be labor, they're called apprentices. This is all done under the campus land guise of educational institutions. And then finally, policing. In communities all across the country, over 75% of colleges and universities have police forces. And then if you are a private university, the Freedom of Information Act exemption that private entities hold is passed on to private university police forces. So what does this mean for Ithaca? You know the story better than I do. But Cornell owns approximately 50% of city property. That's tax exempt. If taxes were paid, about $35 million, this would account for half of the city budget. So when we put these things, these conditions on the spreadsheet, it is clear that the costs far outweigh the benefits. And this is a story that I've seen all across the country, which inspired me to build out my Smart Cities Lab with a series of solutions to combat and think through this universe city landscape. My Smart Cities Research Lab, we research and consult on best practices for building out equitable, urban, and living communities. But we specifically focus on university-driven development. So in this work, we call for school reparations from university-driven practices of slavery, indigenous land seizures, Cornell, Jim Crow practices, and urban renewal practices. We call for pilots, payments in lieu of taxes, but we also call for community benefits agreements tied to all campus projects that include everything from community centers and access to community facilities by residents to affordable housing land trusts, not at 120 AMI, but 40 to 80% AMI, and zip code specific free education, living wage job opportunities and training, and procurement contracts for local community small businesses, all governed by a community advisory board. We call for community engaged endowments, moving portions of the endowment from money market accounts to community serving financial institutions, and earmarking a percentage to social justice and community development spending. With a near $10 billion endowment, schools are required to pay out a 5% of their endowment to maintain its tax-exempt status. But on a $10 billion endowment, an additional 3% for community engaged projects would not be felt at all by an institution like Cornell University. We call for community-based planning and zoning boards, crafting neighborhood plans on all campus development projects that are not just advisory, but have legislative power to approve or deny university projects. We call for civil city and county assessors to engage in the public assessment of campus land valuation and taxation based on educational versus non-educational uses. We call on policing divest invest, divesting from armed security forces, broken windows policing, and investing in teams of healthcare students and professionals offering public health services, trauma care, alongside housing and food security. A perfect example of the work I'm talking about was what I was able to do with the amazing organization called New Haven Rising in New Haven, Connecticut, a coalition of faculty, students, residents, and city government holders. Yale University is the biggest landholder in the city of New Haven. All of its properties, most of the properties are tax exempt. They also hold a powerful control over the city of New Haven, whereby their police force has jurisdiction over the entire city. People call it Yale Haven. And the K through 12 schools are struggling, especially in Black and brown communities in New Haven. And what would make the public schools better? What they get their funds? From property taxes. So New Haven Rising engaged in a powerful Yale Pay Your Share campaign in 2021 and 2022. Protest rallies. As you can see here on the screen, they use artists, activists from across the city. This went all down the length of the street. The image in red was Yale's contribution, which was the biggest in the country at the time, $12 million. But the strip in blue went the length of the block, which earmarked Yale's endowment, which at the time was $35 billion. There were projection screens on Yale buildings that show that if Yale's properties were actually assessed for property taxes, they would owe an additional $157 million in addition to the $14 million that they pay. And so this campaign was important. Everywhere that Yale went, housing, policing, healthcare, governance, New Haven Rising was there. In the educational space, they brought me in to offer speeches, to write op-eds. We were there at every turn. So ultimately, last year, they were able to bring Yale to the table after 30 years of struggle to require them and to make them pay an additional $52 million in tax relief for the next 6 years. Small change compared to $40 billion endowment. But Yale did not want to come into the table, and it was only through people power across the city of New Haven and with their allies like me that we were able to get Yale to the table and acknowledge that their prosperity came from tax abatement. And the struggle continues in this land struggle. I'm talking to residents and DSA members and labor unions and community groups in Baltimore, across the state of Massachusetts, across the state of Rhode Island, trying to put forward state-level pilot programs. In Philadelphia, I was able to consult with a local city councilwoman, and we were able to put together Philly's first ever mandatory inclusionary zoning policy in the heart of the University City neighborhood, where Penn and Drexel are touting and courting researchers and tech companies to come and do work in their backyard. In Berkeley, we are fighting to uphold the long-range development plan that puts a limit on the over-enrollment of students without enough campus housing that spills over into the city of Berkeley and raises housing costs above the means of longtime residents. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, I'm working with the Graduate Employees Organization because they have made a mandate in their recent contract negotiations to make a campaign that an unarmed, non-police response team should be included in their contract negotiations. So these are some of the things that we can do, ways we can imagine broadly about what it means to be a mighty, powerful host community that forces these institutions to see their value by being in our towns, being in their communities. Because in the end, I am not against higher education. Schools have the capacity to do great things. But in celebrating the growth, we must do away with what I call the myth of the schoolhouse. We cannot discuss Cornell's social impact by what the school says it does. We must evaluate institutions like Cornell by what they actually do, all the ways they touch our lives and shape our financial conditions. For far too long, city leaders and university administrators detail the benefits that Ithaca receives by having Cornell in its presence. But given the direction of resources from community to campus, it is time we ask, what would Cornell be without Ithaca? It's time for the big red bandit to pay its fair share.
1, 2, 3.